So let's start off with the axial division of the skeleton. It seems reasonable to make our way from the superior to the inferior parts of the axial division. So let's focus our attention on the skull first. The skull bones can be categorized as either cranial bones or facial bones. And in total, there are 22 bones belonging to the skull. Let's start with the cranial bones first. So the cranial bones, these are the bones that are directly supporting and protecting the brain. These bones also serve as sites of muscle attachment or attachment for muscles of the head and of the neck. In total, there are 8 bones in the cranial division. So there are 22 that belong to the skull. 8 of those 22 bones are cranial bones. And we'll cover those bones here in just a few moments. So the cranial cavity is the cavity that is formed from the cranial bones, because the cranial bones internally, of course, are not solid. They have to accommodate the brain and the structures that are associated with it. And so we see that the cranial cavity is the space within the cranial bones that is mostly occupied by the brain and its accessory structures. The cranial cavity consists of the walls of the cranial cavity, I should say, consist of all of the cranial bones. So these are the frontal bone, the parietal bones, the temporal bones, occipital bone, and ethmoid and sphenoid bones. So let's take a look at those now. So from the lateral side of the skull, we can see all of the cranial bones. Anteriorly here we see in yellow, we see the frontal bone that makes up the anterior and superior part of the cranial bones. The parietal bones form the superior and lateral aspects of the skull. The posterior part of the skull is occupied by the occipital bone. The temporal bones make up pretty much the lateral aspects of the skull. And then also as part of the cranial bones in magenta here, we see the sphenoid bone. We'll get a better look at that from other viewpoints. And then this orange little sliver of bone right here is part of the ethmoid bone. So it is important to note here that the parietal bones and the temporal bones have right and left halves. So this means that there are 2 parietal bones and 2 temporal bones, which even though we only have 6 named bones here in the cranial division, we actually have 8 total, because the parietal bones, there's a right and left parietal bone, and the temporal bone, there's a right and left temporal bone as well. And so that gives us 8 total in our count of bones for the cranial division. So the other cranial bones, that is the frontal, the occipital, the sphenoid, and the ethmoid bones, are only a single individual bone, and they do not have right and left halves. So from a lateral view of the skull, we can also see the external acoustic meatus. This is also referred to as the external auditory meatus in some textbooks. This is the passageway that leads, you can see it right here, that's the external auditory or external acoustic meatus here. And this is the passageway that leads into the skull to the eardrum. The eardrum is also known as the tympanic membrane. And behind the eardrum and its tympanic membrane is the middle ear. And the middle ear contains 3 tiny bones, the stapes, the incus, and the malleus. And we don't count these 3 bones as cranial bones because they are, for one, they are associated with the special sensory structures of the ear. And second, they're not counted as cranial bones because they do not support and protect the brain like the other cranial bones do. So for this reason, they are not counted as cranial bones. Yes, they are within the skull, but we do not count them as cranial bones simply because they don't support and protect the brain as the other ones do. So how these guys work is that when sound causes the tympanic membrane to vibrate, it moves these 3 middle ear bones. And the movement of these 3 middle ear bones in turn transmits this information to the sensory structure of the ear, which is called the cochlea. And that sensory structure, that cochlea, is located in the inner ear. And so these 3 bones are essentially serving as the link between the tympanic membrane and the cochlea of the ear. From the posterior view of the skull, we get a better view of most of the occipital bone, the left and right parietal bones, along with the part of the left and right temporal bones as well. From underneath the skull, we can better see the sphenoid bone, which we didn't get a great view of from the lateral perspective. We can see a little bit of it, but not much. This gives you a much better idea of its actual shape. And we also see a good chunk of the occipital bone as well. So returning to the sphenoid bone, we can see that the sphenoid bone is essentially shaped like a butterfly. And in kind of following that shape, the processes on the lateral sides of the sphenoid bone are wing-like, and we call those the larger ones that are more laterally located are the greater wings. These ones right here, even though they're not labeled as such, these are the lesser wings of the sphenoid bone. On the occipital bone here, we see these two smooth surfaces just in front of this large opening here. And these two smooth surfaces are called the occipital condyles. And these condyles make a joint, they make a connection with the first vertebra of the vertebral column. And so these two occipital condyles are what the skull uses to rest on the vertebral column. And of course, we can also see this another thing that's very apparent from this viewpoint is this very large opening in the base of the skull. That's called the foramen magnum. Now, the foramen magnum, which literally just means large opening, is found on the inferior side of the occipital bone. And anatomically, this is a very important landmark because this marks the location where the brain ends and the spinal cord begins. Essentially, the spinal cord is just a long filament-like extension of the brain. So there's no real clean division between the brain and the spinal cord. They just kind of seamlessly blend into one another. The foramen magnum is an anatomically important landmark because it marks the location where the brain ends and the spinal cord begins. And so you can see this horizontal red line that I placed in this image here. And this horizontal red line corresponds to the foramen magnum. So anything above that red line here is a brain structure. Anything below it here is going to belong to the spinal cord. Again, in looking at the underside of the skull from an inferior viewpoint here, we see passages for blood vessels, and we have kind of a pair, or I should say two pairs of passageways for blood vessels. The large kind of jugular foramen these are in closest proximity to the occipital condyles here. The jugular foramen essentially kind of sits at the junction between the occipital bone and the orange temporal bones here. And these allow for the passage of a vein called the internal jugular vein, which drains blood from the skull and returns it back to the heart. And it also allows passage for 3 cranial nerves, that is cranial nerves 9, 10, and 11, which we'll learn about in the peripheral nervous system when we get to that chapter. The one that's just anterior to it is a little bit smaller. These are called the carotid canals. These are just anterior to those jugular foramina. And this is a passageway for an artery called the internal carotid artery that delivers a good majority of the blood that's going to the head. It delivers a good majority of that blood to the brain. And so the internal carotid artery is really one of the main passageways through which blood is going to the brain. These two internal carotid arteries supply blood to essentially 80% of the what are called the cerebral hemispheres of the brain. And what we also see too is that they are close in proximity to the inner ear and the structures that are associated with the middle and inner ear. And so this explains why during any kind of like excitation or physical exertion, if you have a very rapid pulse and your heart is pounding, then you can often hear that. And the reason for that is you're actually hearing the blood as it's moving through the internal carotid arteries to the brain. From an internal view of the floor of the skull, so essentially we've kind of removed the frontal bone and the parietal bones. We're looking in, kind of down at the skull. We see the inside of the sphenoid bone here in magenta, the occipital bone here in brown, the temporal bones in orange, and a much better view, or a little bit better view, of the ethmoid bone here in kind of a tan color. Back to the, kind of returning to the sphenoid bone here, we see a saddle kind of like structure basically in the center of the sphenoid bone, and that's called the sella turcica, which means Turkish saddle. So it resembles essentially a saddle that you would put on a horse. The depression, there's a little groove essentially, because just like a saddle, you've got kind of the front and the back edges of it raised up, and then in the middle of it, you have a little depression where you would sit. In the middle of this saddle here, there's a little depression called the hypophyseal fossa, and that's labeled here. The fossa that's in the middle of the sella turcica is where the pituitary gland sits. So the pituitary gland is a small gland at the base of the brain. It's part of the endocrine system, and we'll talk about that in A&P2. So from this view, it's also easy to see why the sphenoid bone, again here in magenta, is called the keystone bone of the cranium, essentially because the sphenoid bone forms a wedge that supports all of the other cranial bones that we talked about. So every single one of the cranial bones that we talked about makes contact in some way, shape, or form with our sphenoid bone. So it is the wedge that's supporting all of those. We also see the optic canals kind of more anteriorly in this sphenoid bone here, these are passageways for the optic nerves that pass from the eyes to the brain to deliver that visual sensory information to the brain so it can be interpreted. The ethmoid bone is essentially just directly anterior or directly in front of our sphenoid bone here. This is only part of the ethmoid bone, but you can see from this viewpoint here, it has these small puncture-like structures in it. They're called cribriform foramina. These foramina are holes in which the olfactory nerves extend down from the brain into the nose, so they can detect the chemicals in the air, and that gives us our sense of smell. The cribriform plate, which houses the cribriform foramina, is essentially the horizontal surface that you're looking at with the foramina in it. And there's also, you can see this little ridge kind of running right in the middle of the cribriform plate. This is a crest-like structure that's in the middle of the ethmoid bone. It's called the crista galli. This is a word that literally means rooster's crest, because it looks like the crest on the head of a rooster. This crest provides an anchoring point for the connective tissues that are surrounding the superficial connective tissues that are surrounding the brain, that are called the meninges, and this is where the meninges attach to this, and it helps keep the brain secured within the skull, so that the brain is not thrown around within the skull. So most of the skull bones, both cranial and facial bones, are immovable because they are united by these interlocking joints that have collagen fibers between them called sutures. There is only one movable bone that belongs to the skull. It happens to be a facial bone, which we'll talk about in the next segment here. And this movable bone is the mandible, or the lower jaw. So if we talk a little bit more about these sutures here, there are 4 sutures that you will see on your lab list. You'll find the coronal suture here. This is the suture, the fibrous joint that is found between the frontal bone here in yellow and the parietal bones here in red. The squamous suture is on the lateral part of the skull, and it's the joint that's found between the parietal bones here and the temporal bones on the lateral part of the skull. So we see that the squamous suture is there. And we can see part of the lambdoid suture here. So this is the joint between the parietal bones in red here and the occipital bone in brown. And finally, if we get a better look at the last of our sutures, which is the sagittal suture, we'd either have to turn the brain or turn the skull around and look at it from behind, or look at the top part of the skull, because the sagittal suture is our last suture on our lab list, and this is found between the two parietal bones, essentially in the superior top center of the skull.